I was really thrilled to be asked to speak today. Thank you. So this talk will outline the development and some of the challenges of curating power and portraiture painting at the court of Elizabeth I. I've been asked to talk about aspects of the curatorial process of curating this display of Elizabethan portraits at Waddesdon, which is a profoundly un-Elizabethan house. You can see here this surreal Victorian French Renaissance chateau on a hill in Buckinghamshire. The core of what I insisted on calling the special display rather than the exhibition, as our marketing people always wanted to call it, was handed to me on a plate. So the core of this display was the loan of 4 Elizabethan portraits. Here is the Hans Ewart portrait of Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk of 1562. Robert Dudley, by an Anglo-Netherlandish painter, Robert Dudley, the 1st Earl of Leicester, of around 1564. And then by Nicholas Hilliard, as we now know, and I'll explain, Elizabeth I and Sir Amias Paulet, her French ambassador, of 1576 to 8. The first painting, the Earl of Leicester, was in fact already on loan to us from one private Rothschild collection, but it was displayed, I'm ashamed to say, rather gloomily in a corner, and although well known through loan and publication, I show you just 3 of the exhibitions and publications it's been in, it has not been given the attention it deserves at Waddesdon. The other 3 paintings came to Waddesdon only last year from another private Rothschild collection, and they could not have made a more satisfying group. As a curator, I wish I could claim credit for the selection of a group of paintings that have such rich contrasts and interconnections, but they were just the paintings that were handed me on a plate. The decision to make a special display of them was made as soon as we heard the news that they were on their way to us. Waddesdon is most famous in terms of portraiture, for its 18th century British portraits. So this, and I show you Reynolds's Mrs. Abington. So this Elizabethan group expands and deepens the story that we can tell at Waddesdon about British portraiture. In fact, there is a new group of Victorian paintings on loan to us from the same other private Rothschild collection in conservation at the moment, which includes 2 other wonderful Watts portraits, this Millet on the left and a Louise Joplin on the right. The Elizabethan portraits will eventually hang in the smoking room, a textile-rich space full of Renaissance works of art, French, German in particular, some Italian, some Netherlandish. And I hope to move at least some of our very small but interesting collection of miniatures into the same room to enhance this new English Renaissance strand. But before they go to their more permanent place in the smoking room, they were hung in the particularly un-Renaissance red anteroom in the main part of the house. And the display sought to show how courtiers use portraits to fashion their public image and to promote themselves in a glamorous, dangerous world. So here they are on the main wall. I bookended the display, as it were, the far left and the far right, with the Anglo-Netherlandish portrait of the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's charismatic suitor, and the doomed Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, on the right. They worked well at either end of the wall, and the public liked this contrast of dashing Dudley, all shimmery in white, who makes a wonderful contrast with Howard in black. Visitors enjoyed comparing the sitters, who were political enemies, the Protestantism of Dudley, the Catholicism of Howard. Both were the sons of executed fathers. Dudley died in a bed, whereas Howard was beheaded for treason. And the public liked this contrast. It worked well. Above all, The visitors seem to enjoy comparing them visually with their similar poses and accoutrements, the prominence of the Order of the Garter in both, as well as other armorial props. In Dudley, on the left, you can see the French Order of Saint-Michel added in the top left-hand corner after the rest was finished. And on the right, half of Howard's coat of arms matched by half of his wife's coat of arms in the pendant portrait, which is at Audley End, which was illustrated on the label. That both sitters touched a piece of cloth emerging from a black velvet pouch particularly intrigued the public, with its hints of gallantry and romance. Howard's appropriate in one of a pair of marriage portraits. Presumably, you read it as presumably a love token from his wife. Dudley's perhaps a token from the Queen. I broke my rules about label word length in the first label for Dudley because I so loved this quotation and wanted to include it. I wanted to show visitors how alert Elizabethans were to the language and details of clothing. Clothing, textiles, and accessories seem to be elements that engage modern visitors in a particularly uninhibited way, and I wanted to encourage this by including in this label the response, a contemporary response, an Elizabethan response to the visual impact of Dudley, dressed similarly to how he is in the portrait from a contemporary, and to include the texture of 16th century English in a small way, in what was a very small display. I just love it, a sight worthy the beholding. Dudley was painted by a Netherlandish painter working in England, whose identity we do not know. It is full of European references, from Titian to the twin pillars of the Habsburgs in the background. Norfolk was painted by Hans Eweth, an Antwerp-born painter working in England. Eweth came to England in the 1540s and was principal court painter during the reign of Catholic Mary I, but saw his favour decline at court during the reign of Elizabeth. The introductory interpretation panel in the room emphasised how these works by Netherlandish painters demonstrated the role played by foreign artists in the self-fashioning of the English court. And this trans-European theme was drawn out further by the paintings that were at the heart of this display, which are Elizabeth I and Sir Amias Paulet, who was Elizabeth's resident ambassador to France from 1576 to 1579. These splendid portraits were painted in France, and the display emphasised their international and diplomatic context. The thing that drew more press attention to this modest display than might otherwise have been expected was that this pair of portraits was painted by Nicholas Hilliard, best known, of course, for his miniatures, watercolours on vellum. And I show you a fantastic sort of self-admiring portrait of himself on the left and of his wife on the right, both painted during his years in France, so the same time as the Rothschild portraits. Scholars have long known that Hilliard painted large oils. There is documentary evidence that he did, but until now, candidates for these paintings have been suggested, but based only on stylistic affinities between them and miniatures. And it is very hard to make watertight attributions based on comparison between works in such different materials, on such different scales, and serving such different functions. These are the first paintings in grate, to use the documentary term in those archives that mention Hilliard painting in grate, full-sized oil paintings that can be firmly attributed to Hilliard. And this certainty is due to the incredible work at the Hamilton Carr Institute near Cambridge. And I show you Sarah Bayliss, who was responsible for most of this work, pretending, in fact, to work on them, one of those frustrating, really annoying things where we had to set it up because the press wanted images of the paintings being worked on, so they were long finished, but she got out her palette again. Analysis at the Hamilton Carr showed that the panels were made from French oak boards, not boards of Baltic oak that were normally used by English painters. French oak boards are narrower and less straight and less suitable for the creation of panels of the size that evolved for English portraiture. Baltic oak could have made a panel of this size with just 3 boards, so that the faces wouldn't have had a split between the boards running through the face itself. Whereas with this from British painters' point of view, this rather rubbishy French meadow oak, which grows much closer to other trees and therefore all wiggly and narrow, you need 4 or 5 boards to make a panel of this standard English portrait size. So we know that these portraits were painted in France. This technical discovery gives unprecedented support to earlier attributions to Hilliard of the Elizabeth portrait, because that was known, it has been published, and it has been attributed for stylistic reasons to Hilliard since the early 20th century, most recently by Roy Strong in the 1980s. However, those attributions were based on stylistic comparison between it and miniatures. And they do share, both portraits share elements very clearly with the miniatures. And I'll just show some of the details in the oil paintings that remind scholars of miniatures. These are the eyes of Elizabeth and Paulet, and particularly the way the line on the upper lid is painted is very typical of Hilliard in his miniatures. This marvelous treatment of the hair, it's really kind of mannerist in my eyes. With this is the oil painting with these fantastic lines, sort of calligraphic lines for the curls. The lace in particular, this is a lovely slide of Paulet's ruff, a detail of Paulet's ruff, and it's painted, it's got very, very thick lead white paint that raises it proud of the surface of the panel, which is very comparable with the sort of three-dimensionality that he achieved for very similar pattern lace in his miniatures. And most significantly, the face pattern of the Queen, which compares with crucially, the miniature is here of Elizabeth I by Hilliard. But it was also, greater weight was given because we identified the male sitter. Edward Town at Yale identified the male sitter as Sir Amias Paulet, the French ambassador. And so that added weight because from manuscript sources we know that Paulet was in France, not just the same time as Hilliard was in France. Hilliard was in France 1576 to 8, Paulet 1576 to 9. But we know from letters that Hilliard was for some of that time actually in Paulet's entourage, so he was actually attached to his embassy. We know from Rothschild inventories and manuscript lists of what was in the Rothschild collection in the 1890s and early 20th century that Paulet was thought, rather hopefully and romantically, to be Robert Dudley. Though having seen the portrait of Robert Dudley earlier, you can see that that's not true. Paulet's years in France overlapped with Hilliard's years in France. So the wood and the geographical location of the sitter adds unprecedented weight to the visual similarities. The scientific analysis that started this all off is still being followed by academic research. One of the great pleasures of this project has been collaborating with colleagues at the Hamilton Carr, Rupert Featherstone and Sarah Bayliss, for example, and at the National Portrait Gallery, Charlotte Bolland in particular, and Edward Town at the Yale Centre for British Art. The discovery that these works are by Hilliard had enormous implications for other works previously attributed to Hilliard, and we were thrilled to be able to borrow the National Portrait Gallery's Phoenix portrait of around 1576, which hung alongside the Rothschild portrait of Elizabeth for the first time, so that for the first time they could be compared in the flesh. And if the Rothschild portrait is Hilliard, the stylistic affinities with the Phoenix portrait now give the Phoenix portrait's attribution much greater weight. Just a few weeks ago, we held a workshop at Waddesdon to bring together curators, academics, and conservators, and it's an exciting moment for studying Hilliard. Elizabeth Goldring, for example, is finishing her book about him with a whole chapter about his time in France and lots of new discoveries. Tracy Sowerby, a historian of diplomacy, helped us to understand the diplomatic context of the paintings, created during the religious wars in France at a very fragile moment in Anglo-French relations. And it was particularly fascinating to hear Rika Jones and Sophie Plender and other conservators who had worked on other related Elizabethan portraits comment on the physical properties of our portraits. There was much discussion about what Hilliard would have learned about oil painting while in France, whom he might have worked with or alongside, and this research is still going on. It's just some of the research that's still going on. I mean, the getting this display on the wall really was the beginning, I feel, of the real research, which is developing now. There they are together, the Phoenix portraits and Elizabeth. One example of research that came too late for inclusion in the labels. I wrote a blog about it, and it will form a part of a big article that Sarah Bayliss, Edward Town, and I are currently finishing, was about the pendant that Paulet wears, which I'd very, very lazily assumed was the Order of St. Michael, of Saint Michel, the highest order of French chivalry at the time. But it couldn't possibly have been. There was no way. I mean, when I thought about it, it made sense. There's no way that the French king would have given Paulet the Order of the Saint Michel. He would have, at this moment of religious wars, he would have considered him a heretic. And although Dudley got it, Dudley and Norfolk actually got it, but that was as a kind of chivalric courtesy to the Queen herself, because as a woman she couldn't receive it herself, so the two highest male courtiers were given it instead. But that sort of put me onto a red herring of it being the Order of Saint Michel. We found out what it is. You can see, I don't know if you can see how it's a kind of figure like this with long, long hair, dancing with her elbow up like this, so that highlight above her shoulder is her elbow. It's a Maynard, somewhat surprisingly. It's this Maynard here, the big one. And rather wonderfully, that's a Tassie cast made in the late 18th century of a large sardonyx that was then in the Marquis of Rockingham's collection. So we know that it survived, and it's very distinctive. The size of it and the integral frame that it has, it's very distinctive, this Mannerist classicizing engraved gem. So I'm really hoping that if it survived till the late 18th century, it might turn up somewhere still. But it was rather an extraordinary thing to find hanging around the neck of this very austere Protestant figure. He's best known, Paulet, for his later job, which was to be the last jailer of Mary Queen of Scots. But he's got this Bacchante figure around his neck. I wonder, here it is again, in a glass cast, so it's easier, well, actually I don't know that it is easier to see at the top there of the two large ones on the left. It reminded me a little bit of the Hunsdon onyx, which is a beautiful Italian Mannerist engraved gem on loan to the V&A, which is supposed, traditionally, it was given by Elizabeth I to her cousin, courtier cousin, Henry Carey. There isn't evidence that she gave it to him, but it just makes me wonder if Elizabeth did have a kind of stash of these very sophisticated Italian gems, or Italian gems that she gave to courtiers. I don't know whether it'll be able to get further than that. But it is another pan-European element, an Italian Renaissance sardonyx of a woman dancing with abandon. It brings in the kind of the culture of gem engraving, gem collecting, which involved makers travelling all around Europe from court to court, the Spanish court, but also the French. Another way we extended the interpretation beyond the labels in the room was through a short film by Leah Caribbean. And I've got just a couple of stills from the film. This is one which it moved. I mean, you have to imagine this a moving film. But it did, for example, allow us to show the difference in scale between a Hilliard in small and a Hilliard in great, as well as making connections between the face patterns. Here's the MPG miniature of Elizabeth on the left. It allowed us to show tracings. This is the tracing of our Rothschild Elizabeth I, traced over the face of the Pelican portrait in the Walker Gallery in Liverpool. And some of the details of these comparisons between miniatures and the oil. And so the film allows a wider public that cannot get to Waddesdon to learn about this story. But the film had to do rather more than we had originally planned. Initially, I had hoped to use the other walls in the room, it's a small room, to give fuller explanation of the science behind the Hilliard attribution. However, this brings us to the creative challenges that sometimes arise when planning things at Waddesdon. As some of you will know, Waddesdon, though a National Trust property, is run by the Rothschild Foundation, headed by Lord Rothschild, and I show you Lucian Freud's portrait of Jacob Rothschild. And Jacob's interest in this display transformed it. In one instance, by an unexpected acquisition that turned up in the library one morning, which you'll see in the corner, this 18th century code artificial stone bust of Elizabeth I, made in about 1780. And although a bit of an anomaly, I think it does work rather well, drawing on historical depictions of the Queen, particularly her effigy in Westminster Abbey and print sources, and it translates these historical sources into a 1780s woman of sensibility, her head at an angle, looking tenderly downwards. And for a collection, I mean, Waddesdon is full of 18th century images of women, so it's quite an interesting link, and it was a nice surprise. Another of Lord Rothschild's ideas was to present a counterpoint to the world of Elizabeth I with images of the current Queen. So, opposite, I'm moving you around the room. There's Lucian Freud's Elizabeth II. Which is very, very rarely seen in public. It uses a tiny canvas to intensify the sense of the painter's scrutiny. We illustrated this photograph of the sitting on an interpretation panel, something that I have to say caught the imagination of the public rather more than the painting itself, if my own conversations with them are anything to go by. The Queen wears the diamond diadem, familiar from postage stamps in the state opening of Parliament, but the painting departs from the conventions of public image making to explore the inner life of the sitter. The Pearly Queen of 2004 was a work that was already at Waddesdon, decorating the restaurant, having been commissioned to celebrate the Queen's 80th birthday. And the Pearly Queen combines a familiar postage stamp image with the popular culture of the pearly kings and queens of London's East End. And it also resonates, it's made of buttons, it also resonates, there it is, it's enormous and buttony, and it resonates with a really important group of buttons. We have a very important collection of buttons, mainly 18th century, at Waddesdon, which was part of the reason that Jacob commissioned it in the first place. The Elizabeth II portraits did make the display seem like a roomful of exhibition rather than the special display I'd originally envisaged. The design and layout made them hang together visually. However, I have to say that I still think the single wall of Elizabeth I and her courtiers held its own on its own terms. I was originally rather doubtful about the idea of adding Elizabeth II, as I did not doubt the power of Elizabeth I to draw the interest and stimulate the imagination of a wide public, and wanted to test my theory that the public would be interested in an interpretative display about the French oak and some of the marvels of Hilliard's technique. However, I do agree, having been rather hostile to the idea of including these works, I think it did encourage the public to think about the functions of royal portraits in a broader way, then and now, and what expectations people have of them. And I want to end just with 5 shots of the room so you can see how it actually ended up looking. So you come up a spiral staircase to get to it. So there was the original core, then the 18th century code stone in Elizabeth and another Elizabeth. Just 2 simple interpretation panels. I mean, this is why I felt it really is a display rather than an exhibition. And then there is a lovely detail of pelican jewel, a version of a pelican jewel that Elizabeth wears on her breasts in the Heliod. Thank you very much.